Welcome to First Look, Washington Post Live's one-stop shop for news and analysis. I'm Jonathan Capehart, associate editor at the Washington Post. Well, every week is a big week in Washington, but this one was big. The House Speaker is having trouble making the moves necessary to avoid a government shutdown. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, was in town to urge continued American financial support, which is part of the budget drama engulfing Washington right now. Joining me now, back from parental leave, Yasmin Abutaleb, White House reporter for the Washington Post. Yasmin, welcome back, and welcome back to First Look.
Thank you so much. It's good to be back.
You've come back at a most incredible time. So let's talk about President Zelensky. He addressed the United Nations and then came to Washington for meetings at the Capitol, the Pentagon, and the White House, where a new $325 million aid package was announced. President Biden took the opportunity to clearly state that the U.S. was in it for the long haul and that the U.S. wasn't going to go it alone. Let's listen.
And that's why we've begun the process of formalizing our long-term commitment to Ukraine's security alongside the G7 and with other partners. And that's why we supported just and lasting peace, one that respects Ukrainian sovereignty and its territorial integrity.
So, Yasmin, in some sense, Zelensky accomplished what he needed to, no?
He did. I mean, there was really never any question that the Biden administration was still behind Ukraine, that they wanted to rally support and make sure that there are no cracks in the Western coalition. And in that way, he was very successful. There are no signs of the Western coalition coming apart, or any of those countries at least vocally expressing any sort of discomfort with continued aid and weapons to Ukraine. But I think it's a little bit more complicated when you look at whether President Zelensky accomplished his goal when it came to maybe winning over some skeptical Republicans on Capitol Hill. I think the threat has never really been the White House and whether Biden would continue to support him, but more so whether Congress would continue to keep appropriating billions of dollars and these weapons and economic aid packages.
So let's keep talking about the Republicans, because Republican lawmakers sent the White House a letter opposing President Biden's plan for an additional $24 billion in aid for Ukraine. President Zelensky reportedly told members of Congress, quote, "If we don't get this aid, we will lose the war." Yasmin, will that shift any lawmakers' thinking? And is there any serious danger, really, that the United States support is waning?
I'm not sure that is going to shift the Republicans who have been very vocal about their opposition to more aid. I think they're probably well aware of that dynamic, but their argument is that this is not the U.S.'s responsibility and we've sent enough money and we need to focus on domestic matters at home. I think the other thing that's important to note about Republicans right now is they are struggling to pass just a basic short-term funding bill. So there are real divisions within the party over just the sort of basic functions of government, let alone trying to pass another $24 billion of aid for Ukraine. I don't think that there's a real threat that the U.S. suddenly cuts off aid right now. I think it's important to remember that all Democrats support continued aid to Ukraine, and many Republicans are still very supportive, including Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, Michael McCall, the head of the House Foreign Relations Committee. So, there is still Republican support in really important places, and with Democratic support, this package, I think, will eventually get passed. In what form and whether it gets watered down or there are concessions is another question. But I think there is a real threat in terms of, the divisions that exist in the Republican Party. I spoke with Senator Chris Murphy this week, who said, the question hanging over the United States over whether they'll continue to support aid to Ukraine, not just through Congress, but who wins the presidential election next year, is weakening Ukraine's hand, and that Russian President Vladimir Putin is paying close attention to that. And because all these divisions are so public, that he maybe feels he can just wait it out.
President Zelensky's meeting with President Biden came a day after he ripped the United Nations, saying that it has, quote, aspirations to compromise with killers rather than save lives. How did that speech go over at the White House?
I think, the there is a lot of agreement that the structure of the UN Security Council doesn't make sense and is quite antiquated, and that Russia and China hold veto power, and so you can't really have any resolutions related to them, and many basic sort of human rights resolutions get voted down. I do think the White House probably thought Zelensky went too far in the way he made those comments. And there's been this ongoing tension since the war in Ukraine has begun, where Zelensky is sort of calling on the United States and the rest of the world to do more. And I think sometimes that creates some tension in that, the president and I think many leaders in Europe feel that they are doing a lot. And this really sort of heated rhetoric is not helpful in maintaining support for that cause. So I think, maybe there was agreement over the general sentiment and some discomfort over exactly how it was worded.
This is President Zelensky's second trip to Washington, if memory serves. Is there any rumbling at all of President Biden going back to Ukraine anytime between, say, now and the November 2024 election?
It's a great question, and I think it's something you can never rule out, especially because the war in Ukraine and maintaining U.S. support for it has been such a central tenet of President Biden's foreign policy. And, I've spoken with some senior administration officials this week who have said, they're well aware that they face challenges in maintaining not just support in Congress, but public support for the war, in that the counteroffensive didn't quite mount the gains that some people may have hoped, and that they maybe need to do some expectation resetting with the public that this war is going to be a long, slow grind. So I have not heard any specific plans about President Biden going to Kyiv in the next year, but I wouldn't rule it out, because that is, of course, a very public show of support and maybe a reminder to people of the toll that it's taking on Ukraine.
And one more quick question, and I acknowledge right now that you might not even know the answer to this, but in those meetings that President Zelensky had with all of the Senate and some House Republicans, including, from what I see from reporting, Speaker McCarthy behind the scenes, any reporting on how matter of fact or blunt he was with members of Congress about their public rhetoric questioning American financial support for the war he's trying to win against Russia?
So I don't yet know what happened in those private conversations, but I think you can look to President Zelensky's public comments yesterday, where he said very clearly if the support was cut off, that Ukraine was going to lose the war. And so, I think he's been very clear that if the U.S. and its Western allies look like they're wavering, Putin will sense an opening, and that it's really important to maintain this public image that there is no crack in support for Ukraine, and that it will continue without issue. Otherwise, I think he's well aware and has communicated that just continues to weaken Ukraine's hand.
All right, Yasmin Abu-Taleb, White House reporter for the Washington Post. Thank you for, coming back to First Look, but also welcome back to your duties at the White House for the Washington Post. Have a good weekend.
You too. Thank you so much, Jonathan.
We're going to keep the conversation going with our Opinions Roundtable in just a moment. Let's go to the opinion side of the Washington Post, where we will find Washington Post Associate Editor Ruth Marcus and Washington Post columnist Megan McArdle. Ruth, Megan, welcome back to First Look.
Hi, Jonathan.
So I'm flipping the script here. We're going to start by talking about the looming, impending, almost certain 99.999% government shutdown. This is for both of you. This is not as terrifying, this looming government shutdown, as, say, the debt ceiling crisis we went through earlier this year. But it is another act in the drama that is the speakership of Kevin McCarthy. Ruth, first you, then Megan. Talk about the prospects of a shutdown from your perspective, and what one would say about McCarthy's control over the House Republican majority.
I'm trying to come up with the right adjective, and as I talk, I'm going to come up with one for the degree of McCarthy's control or not. Look, you're completely right, Jonathan. The last crisis, about to go over a cliff moment that we faced was much scarier with the debt ceiling. This is a rodeo that we've been to many times before, and we've seen the government shut down for short periods or longer periods many times before. It's stupid. It's no way to run a government. It causes short-term damage to both recipients of government and employees in government, and long-term damage, and that's completely unnecessary in terms of economic growth, but it is survivable. The question is whether and government will almost certainly shut down for some period, and even more certainly will manage to start itself up again. The real question is what that will mean for Speaker McCarthy's very tenuous, there's my adjective, speakership. And it has been on the cliff's edge, to get back to that cliff, really since the start of his speakership. And the problem for his opponents is they don't really have another alternative. And he is now in the position, very interesting position, of kind of threatening them, just bring it on and let's see what happens. So I guess we're all going to see what happens.
Yeah, Megan, would love your view, and whether, Speaker McCarthy is between a rock and a hard place. He has no good options, and all the options put his grip on the speakership at risk.
Yeah, look, I think that this is a symptom. I concur with everything Ruth says. This is moronic. There is just no reason for it. It's not going to achieve anything for anyone. It's just showboating by a Republican, the extremist members of a Republican caucus who have given up on the idea of Congress as a place where anything happens and see it more as like a trampoline that elevates you to higher office, or at least elevates you to higher media attention. And I think that, the saving grace for McCarthy is, who wants this job? Why would anyone, or rather, like, who wants this job can get it, can do it. The fact is that the 10 years ago, or gosh, I'm old, 13 years ago, with the Tea Party and Obama, all of these theatrics you could write off as the naivete of people who were new to office and didn't understand that, like, you can't just get what you want in Washington by throwing a tantrum. There's a bunch of other people here and you have to get them on board. But at this point, it's become just a constant problem for the Republicans that they don't actually want to do anything. They want to, tweet for their constituents. They want to be on C-SPAN getting clips talking about how tough they are. And they are achieving that, unfortunately, at the expense of U.S. government.
Yeah, giving speeches that are shown on C-SPAN where you don't see that they're speaking to empty chambers. So Jeff Stein, our colleague, Post colleague, reported that the White House doesn't want a government shutdown, but they firmly believe the public will blame the Republican-led House if there is one. I mean, sure, I can see how that's true, but is that wishful thinking on the White House's part, Ruth?
I don't think it's wishful thinking. I think it is true that anybody who's paying attention to this latest iteration, I love Megan's use of the word tantrum, because the Republicans really have become the tantrum party, certainly House Republicans. But anybody who's paying attention will understand where the fault lies. The question is whether that in itself is a motivating factor for voters. They are probably more apt to blame the administration, fairly or not, for high gas prices or for high price of milk at the grocery store, and vote according to that, on the basis of that, than they are to say, well, these House Republicans can't govern, so we're going to vote them out of office. I'm not really sure, especially because this has become, sadly, business as usual, that even if there is blame to go around, that blame will end up having political consequences.
Part of the shutdown drama involves funding for Ukraine. The president was in town yesterday. He spoke to the Senate, denied the opportunity to speak to the House. Megan, should the Ukrainian people view that as a sign of weakening American resolve in its support for their nation?
Look, I think that we know that there is a faction of the Republican caucus that is skeptical of Ukraine, just in part because they're skeptical of anything that Joe Biden does. It's not, Ukraine could be there are some real reservations. Can Ukraine win this war, right? But that's not really what's happening at this point. What's happening at this point is that Republicans are just kind of reflexively oppositional on a bunch of stuff. And I think also that this has gotten mixed up with Afghanistan and the Iraq War and the way that Republican critiques of those evolved, of their own party, not just of Democrats. So it's weird when you talk to people, like you will talk to people who are Republican voters, and they will kind of talk as if we are sending troops to Ukraine, which we are not, right? We are sending money, but we're not sending so much money that this is going to bankrupt the US government or severely impair domestic priorities. But there is a kind of actual broad native skepticism, but then that is piled on top of the general opposition to anything the Biden administration does. And I think that those two things, we've known about that, right? This is not news. This is not a surprise. I think the sense is that McCarthy wants to do this, but he needs to find a way through his caucus. And that's, I think, true of a lot of things.
I think walk over hot coals would be preferable, I think. Ruth, Senate Republicans are in line with Senate Democrats and President Biden when it comes to aiding Ukraine. In the end, does this mean the U.S. support of Ukraine will be secured eventually?
Probably eventually, but I want to go back to something that Megan said, because I do agree that there is reflexive oppositionism to anything that comes out of Joe Biden's mouth or the Biden administration. But I think it actually is a problem that we see among House Republicans and among a faction of the Republican voters that actually goes deeper than that. And that is, this is no longer Ronald Reagan's party. Ronald Reagan believed in confronting the evil empire. The empire is gone, but the evil remains. We saw that with the invasion of Ukraine. And Ronald Reagan Republicans and Ronald Reagan's Republican Party would have been leading the charge, as some Republicans, and put the Senate Minority Leader in that camp, as some Republicans appropriately and impressively do. But this kind of America does not have a role in the world to promote and protect democracy and to stand up against outrageous aggression on the part of Russia is a new and disturbing development in the Republican Party. I am worried that it is not just about Joe Biden. It will outlast Joe Biden. And it's really a problem for America. It could be a problem for America to maintain its important role in the world.
Before I go to my next question, Megan, do you have any thoughts on that broader thing that Ruth just mentioned?
I mean, cosign. I think I am indeed worried that there is a faction of the Republican Party that just does not want to take the role on the world stage that the world actually, I think, I was a kid of the 90s, and so I came up thinking like, well, we won the Cold War, it's over, we don't need America as a superpower anymore. And I think the rise of China and Russia has shown that we need it more than ever in some ways. And that the Republican Party is no longer ready to stand up for that role. Back in my day, it was Republicans who were the people who made that case forcefully, and Democrats who were like, well, couldn't we just, tend our own garden? And it is disappointing for me, and I think worrisome for me that to watch that happening to the Republican Party.
Can I come back to a budget question here? Because I'm reminded that also what's at work here in terms of, it's not just aid for Ukraine that's a stumbling block into getting meeting the budget deadline of October 1st, but some Republicans are taking this principled stand that they don't want to vote for a continuing resolution because that's not how things should be governed. And then on the other side, but when it comes to, they want to do a budget, but they're going against the agreed upon deal that got us from going over the cliff with the debt ceiling by really ramping down government funding. Is this principled opposition to continuing resolutions? Does that make any sense? Ruth, I'm going to throw that to you before we go to more serious topics.
Well, really quickly, if you're going to have, there is a principled opposition to be had against continuing resolutions. I'm a very big believer in regular order and the budget process, and let's pass individual appropriations bills. But the time to have that concern and act on that concern is when there's enough time to get this done, and not at the edge of a government shutdown, and not at the cost of a government shutdown. I'm just going to, since I'm talking, want to take the opportunity to say one more thing about Ukraine, which I think is really important, which is President Zelensky makes a very powerful point when he says that Ukraine will lose the war if it doesn't get these weapons and this funding. But the problem that he has is he can't say the converse. He can't say Ukraine will win this war if it gets X. And that's the problem. As this conflict, which we thought was going to be over in a matter of weeks as Russia seized Kyiv, thank goodness it didn't. But as this conflict drags on, it is both worrisome and understandable that people are going to say, how does it end and when does this end, and show us an end that is a win. And that's the challenge primarily for Ukraine, but also for those in the US who support the funding.
Mm-hmm. All right, hard pivot here to the 2024 presidential election. We don't have a lot of time, and I really do want to get to one really serious topic after this one. Excuse me, Megan, last Friday, Donald Trump gave a speech where he seemed to think he ran against President Obama in 2016, not Hillary Clinton, who was his actual opponent. And the Wall Street Journal editorial board criticized him for not debating. The question here is, why won't he debate? And is it really because he has a substantial lead in the race for the Republican presidential nomination? Or is he scared?
Why should he debate, right? What does he get out of it, right? Now, look, we could say that you should do this because this is part of our civic norms, but I mean, we're talking about Donald Trump here. Why there is no personal benefit to him, right? He is a massive lead in the polls. The only thing he can do at a debate is lessen his lead. There is no way he's going to improve by going on stage and beating the heck out of one of his competitors or risking getting beaten by them. And so I think it is sadly rational. I wish that that were not the case. And I think that obviously as a kind of idealistic matter, he should debate, but he's not going to because it doesn't benefit him. There's just no electoral upside for him.
Ruth, isn't the other danger for him that he'll perjure himself on the debate stage?
Well, not perjure himself on the debate stage, but
yeah, 'cause it's
maybe
not a court.
maybe say a truth that will end up being used against him in a court of law. I think that for Trump is a minor aspect of what is a very, so I'd say, canny strategic decision, as Megan said, not to to sit on his lead and not to risk it. And you see the Wall Street Journal editorial page. You see former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie trying to taunt Trump into taking the bait and turning up. I don't see that happening because Trump, sad to say, is too smart for that, even though, of course, for the interests of democracy, he should debate.
Right. And excuse me, you cannot perjure yourself on a debate stage, but you can perjure yourself in a court of law. All right, I'm going to go rogue here with this last question because neither of you know I'm going to ask this, nor does the control room. But so apparently, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer changed the rules, the dress code for the Senate. You both know me. I prefer to see people, nicely dressed, but I can't get as exercised as I thought I would over this rule change. I would just love for you each in the less than 4 minutes that we have left, just your thoughts on, was it the right thing to do or a dumb thing to do? Does it cheapen the institution, or has the institution already done that all by itself? Megan, you go first.
So I think a few things. One is that, like the things that we now think of as like formal business attire is actually what was known as the college look 100 years ago. And people decried the loss of stiff celluloid collars, in favor of these soft, comfortable clothes. So this is a process that has been going on for thousands of years, where we change what we wear, and old people are like, this is terrible. The second thing I think is that obviously this is a concession to Fetterman. But I mean, I will, and people who have strokes who are cognitively fine may struggle with fine motor control tasks like doing buttons, right? And I think maybe the answer was to give him a special pass. But I think the thing I would note is that the staffers still have to show up in suits. And that, to me, is actually kind of a problem, right? You should not be setting higher standards for your junior employees than you are setting for the people who are in charge of making the laws of the land. And if John Fetterman cannot wear a suit to the Senate, then I think no one should have to. I think there is a broad shift towards informality that was really accelerated by the pandemic. We all learned we liked slopping around in our leggings and our sweatpants. But if we're going to make that shift, then it should be a democratic shift that puts the people in higher office, not with special privileges, but first among equals, as it were.
A small d democratic shift is what you mean. And I just want to state for the record, every day during the pandemic, I showered, shaved, put on cologne, and got dressed and went right to the den. Ruth.
Wow. Well, you win. Look, I am not pro dress code, but I am pro dressing appropriately. I think we don't have a dress code that I'm aware of at the Washington Post, but when I go into the office, I'm not going in my pajamas. Though I have seen some pretty relaxed dressing there, which doesn't necessarily sit so well with me. I think it's very odd that this august body, the world's greatest deliberative body, cannot trust the supposed grown-ups who work there to understand and decide for themselves what is appropriate dress. At the same time, I do not cotton to Senator Fetterman or anybody else, staff or senator, coming in looking like a schlub. When I woke up this morning, I got out of my pajamas. I'm not even wearing the proverbial pajama bottoms. I'm wearing perfectly appropriate bottoms. I put on makeup. I brushed my hair. I didn't quite get to the Capehart level of grooming, but few of us do. I don't understand why they cannot decide for themselves and meet, de minimis, perhaps not, Downton Abbey levels of dress, but appropriate levels of dress for the modern world. And so I think it's a kind of sad commentary on where we are.
I would be willing to endorse a dress code if they all had to show up in Downton Abbey level, the gray trousers, the cutaway coat. I think that would be appropriate and set a good example for the rest of the country.
Look, you know what? That I would love to serve my country by coming up with the guardrails for the appropriate dress for people who work on Capitol Hill, from elected members of Congress right down to the interns. Because I'm afraid if you don't put some kind of guardrails and rules, if you just say, come as you are, Lord help us. Ruth Marcus, Megan McArdle, as always, thank you for coming to First Look. Have a good weekend.
You too.
Too.
Head to WashingtonPostLive.com to find more information about next week's interviews and to register. I'm Jonathan Capehart. Thank you for watching Washington Post Live's First Look.